words nuclear and war scare you, you're not alone, because the world is on edge right now with Russia taking over Europe's biggest nuclear power plant and the Secretary of State overseas saying the stability of Europe hangs in the balance right now. Just ahead, the heartbreaking video we're getting from a train station in Kyiv as Ukrainians try to get to safety. Plus, the ones who are coming to the U.S. will get temporary protected status. But for the thousands who are not from European countries, it's not as easy. We take a spotlight on how this is putting refugee policies under the microscope here. And with Vladimir Putin threatening to put reporters in prison for spreading fake news, quote unquote, about his war, one Republican senator is saying, just take this guy out. He does not mean on a date. More on the pushback Lindsey Graham is getting, including from some unlikely sources. We'll also tell you about a story that is giving Gone Girl, with a California woman in court today for apparently making up her own kidnapping. Why prosecutors now think those bruises she gave herself. And in the first sign of a return to normal, maybe in the sports world, the NFL plans to drop all of its COVID protocols for the season coming up. So was this the right move? We're getting into it later in our show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and tonight the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine is getting worse, with another 200,000 people leaving the country in just the last 24 hours. And the UN now saying the total could end up being about a quarter of Ukraine's population. Take a look. This is Kyiv, Ukraine's capital. You can see people trying to get out. Look at that baby in a car seat being lifted above the crowd to try to keep that kid safe. People crowding into these trains, kids crying. There is a sense of panic here over the inevitable arrival of Russia's military, even though a senior U.S. defense official says they haven't gotten any closer to Kyiv in the last 24 hours. But that's not to say the Russian troops are not advancing elsewhere. They are. Secretary of State Tony Blinken in Brussels today, accusing Russia of using more and more brutal methods against civilians.
I think the terrible expectation is that the suffering we've already seen is likely to get worse before it gets better for as long as Russia pursues these methods.
And right as we were coming on the air, we found out that the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, might be Zooming with senators tomorrow. They've been invited for that session, a day after what he called a night that could stop history, when Russia took over a nuclear power plant by force. A fire started in the plant. So in the middle, if you're looking at your screen, that's what you're seeing right in the center there. Ukraine says 3 people died in this attack. The Pentagon says there's no evidence that any radioactive material, right, any of the bad stuff, if you will, leaked during this thing. But the Defense Department spokesperson was very clear about just how urgent that situation is. Watch.
Attacking a nuclear power plant is exceedingly dangerous and could have visited a lot more damage and destruction to the people of Ukraine and to the and perhaps even to neighboring countries.
Matt Bradley is joining us now from Lviv, Ukraine. And Matt, just to sort of orient our viewers as to where you are in the part of the country that is basically closer to Poland, further away from Russia, right? But let me pull up a map here of where some of these other nuclear plants are. Apparently, Russia, according to the UN, is about 20 miles away from the second biggest nuclear power plant in Ukraine. You can see where these power plants are on this image in comparison to those big cities, Matt. I mean, this is, you know, we said it a second ago. We heard it from the Pentagon, an urgent situation.
Yeah, I mean, Ukraine relies for more than half of its energy or its electricity on nuclear power. So that's an urgent situation. There's 4 main nuclear power plants in the Ukraine, 15 different reactors. But, you know, whether or not we're going to start to see Russia targeting them, I think we can't make that leap and say that Russia actually targeted the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. That would be maybe even assigning too much recklessness to their motives. Clearly, they didn't want to have a nuclear disaster that, if it were to ignite, it would spill over the borders into their own country. Even if we assign this total selfishness to the Russians, it just doesn't make sense in terms of motive.
Talk to me about what we heard from the NATO Secretary General, who is saying that Russia is using so-called cluster bombs to kill Ukrainian civilians. I want to play that sound for a second.
This is brutality. This is inhumane. This is violating international law.
So it's brutality. It's inhumane. It's violating international law. Ukraine is all but begging, as you know, for a no-fly zone. That seems to be a non-starter, right, with the West, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, a no-fly zone would essentially mean that the NATO countries or the U.S. would have to actually engage in a firefight with Russian Air Force. That would be really tough. I mean, you're talking about essentially American or NATO forces shooting down Russian jets. So that's kind of a non-starter for the West, which has already said that it's not going to be engaged in that kind of thing. You know, that's going to be a tough one. That's a big ask, and the Ukrainians have been asking for that for quite a while. But when it comes to these cluster bombs, you know, this is a big issue right now. Whether or not this is against international law, as we constantly are hearing, well, it's against some treaties. Russia's not a party to the treaty that forbids the use of cluster bombs. And by the way, Hallie, neither is the U.S. The U.S. hasn't used cluster bombs for a couple of decades. They have used them fairly recently. So it's not something that isn't in the U.S. arsenal. The Russians have used them before. They used them in Syria. It's a nasty weapon, but we're kind of painting ourselves, you know, we could end up with egg on our face. The U.S. uses these weapons and has used them in the past, not recently, but recently enough where it's kind of uncomfortable for us to start throwing accusations at someone like at a country like Russia and saying, don't use these weapons. 110 countries throughout the world forbid the use of cluster munitions. The U.S. and Russia aren't part of that. So,
you know, one of the things we mentioned as we're coming on the air, Matt, just, you know, popping into, I know your email, mine is NBC News confirming that senators have been invited to a briefing now with President Zelensky tomorrow, obviously virtual, of course. This is going to be, you know, over Zoom or something similar. He's been delivering messages to the Ukrainian people and, frankly, to the rest of the world. I want to play the most recent one or a part of it. Watch.
I would like to call upon you not to be silent. If Ukraine will not stand, Europe will not stand.
What's the sense of morale that you're feeling right now, that you're getting right now as you're in Ukraine, as you're talking to people there?
Yeah, morale was sky high a couple days ago, but I got to say, I really don't see this maintaining itself. This has always been Russia's fight to lose. The fact of the matter is the Ukrainians surprised and impressed the world with the first week, the first days of their fight against the Russians, a vastly powerful force, overwhelming in its strength. But now we're starting to see the Russians moving up the Dnieper River from the south. That Zaporizhzhia plant, that's one of the main targets that they've managed to take in just the last 24 hours. Look, I mean, this is still Russia's fight to lose. Even if the Ukrainians have surprised and impressed the world, as I just said, this could change at any minute, and it could change within the next hours or days. Hallie?
Matt Bradley, live for us there in Lviv. Matt, it's really great to see you there reporting on the ground. As always, stay safe. Thank you. Here's the thing, right? If you were in Russia right now, there's a better than not chance that you don't know anything about what we just mentioned, because this new law pushed by Vladimir Putin threatens to throw any journalist behind bars for 15 years for spreading so-called false information about the war in Ukraine. And let's be clear, that just means stuff that Putin doesn't like, right? This is him. He was talking with top advisors there in Russia today. And we've already seen some of the reaction from the international community. The BBC has pulled out its journalists from Russia for safety reasons. And Russia's last big independent paper says it's going to delete all of its content about war. Why? So it doesn't get prosecuted. Then you've got some of the reaction here at home, right? And a kind of political curveball thrown by Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who is absolutely not backing away from his comments that the Russian people should, in his words, take out Vladimir Putin. Watch.
The Putin nightmare, the Putin killing machine needs to end. And I'm not calling for troops on the ground in the Ukraine. I'm not calling for an invasion of Russia by the West or the United States. But I am calling for the good people of Russia to stand up and end this sooner rather than later.
And that's not even the most sort of explosive piece of what we heard from Senator Lindsey Graham, who overnight had said, referencing Brutus, that the Russian people should stand up and take out the president of Russia. His spokesperson saying he also meant a coup. But again, Graham's not backing away from this. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki has responded. We're going to get to that in a second. But you have some pushback to Graham from even members of his own party, right? Democrats pushing back, but even some Republicans, too, are calling this a bad idea, saying his comments are not helpful because the world is watching. Even Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Republican congresswoman, no stranger to controversy herself, says what Graham is saying is dangerous and unhinged. And, of course, you know Russia had something to say about it, too. Its press secretary for the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, saying, quote, This is his quote: "Not everyone manages to maintain sobriety. I would even say sanity, and many lose their minds." Joining me now is Leanne Caldwell on Capitol Hill. And Leanne, here's why this matters, right? Because Putin is on defense right now. The world, most of the rest of the world, is united against what he's doing in Ukraine. And the Russians, his team basically, has been eager to look for any reason to claim persecution by the Americans, right? So there is a risk that what Lindsey Graham is saying now becomes propaganda played over and over again in Moscow.
Yeah, it could be weaponized in Russia. And we all know that there's a lot of propaganda, as you just mentioned, happening in Russia right now. And so this is actually perhaps real news that they would be able to play to the Russian people to, you know, as you mentioned at the top of the show, people could get up to 15 years in prison for based on what they are reporting. Now, this is coming from the Russian state. And yeah, this could give fuel to the fire because we know that the people in Russia, doesn't have a lot of support for this. There's been anecdotal reports of the fact that people did not think that there was actually going to be a war in Ukraine. And so, yeah, this could be something that Putin uses to his advantage for the public in Russia.
Here's how the White House press secretary, I alluded to this moment. I said we'd play it, so let's do it. Here's how she responded when she was asked about this earlier today. Not too long ago, actually. Watch.
That is not the position of the United States government, and certainly not a statement you'd hear come from the mouth of anybody working in this administration.
So clearly pushback from Democrats from the White House. Pushback, though, on the other side from, for example, Republican senator, fellow senator of Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, who called this, and I'm paraphrasing, an extraordinarily bad idea, basically, to imply the assassination of another sitting head of state at this extremely tense and volatile moment.
Yeah, the criticism is coming from the left, the right, the far right, like you mentioned, Marjorie Taylor Greene, although I don't think that her opinion really matters much in these sorts of discussions, serious discussions. But what, Senator Cruz said what needs to happen instead of taking out the leader of another country is that the United States needs to continue very tough sanctions against Russia, needs to arm the Ukrainians, get that $10 billion that the administration asked for, approve it so that they have the humanitarian and defense capabilities that Ukraine needs. Now, that is where the discussion is focused on Capitol Hill. Senator Graham is an outlier. Of course, this is not American policy to assassinate the president of another country. But also today, Senator Graham introduced a bill or a resolution supporting Putin being tried for war crimes. So, Graham has been a hawk. He's been anti-Putin for a very long time. Why he decided to come out with this position, I have no idea. But there it is, and not a lot of people support it.
Leanne Caldwell. It's telling it like it is on Capitol Hill. Leanne, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Now to an NBC News exclusive that's super interesting here. And the news, as we've learned, that members of the group Anonymous, the hackers group, they're basically declaring cyber war on Russia. They claim to have targeted more than 1,500 Russian websites, including the defense ministry, including the sites of some Russian oil companies. And now, you know who they have their eye on? Putin.
This is a message to Vladimir Putin from Anonymous. Members of Anonymous have declared cyber war against your aggressive regime.
U.S. officials are saying that this started right after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and right now you have some sites in Russia that are not even accessible, while a ton of government and military records are getting basically broadcast online. Tom Costello had an exclusive interview with a cybersecurity official on this, a top official. He is here in studio for the show tonight. Tom, we're so glad to have you because this is fascinating stuff. I mean, it is so interesting and super important.
Yeah. It is important, and specifically, the United States is concerned about the potential that the Russians are going to view this attack by Anonymous as an attack coming from the West, and that the Russians will retaliate against everybody. But here's a quick list of the sites, 1,500-plus sites, according to Anonymous, that they have now attacked already in Russia. They claim that they've already hit the Kremlin-controlled news agencies, including RT, the Ministry of Defense, the Space Agency as well, Russian oil companies like Gazprom, internet companies, and even some TV channels have also been attacked.
They've also targeted some U.S. sites, too. I mean, you speak, I think, to your point, as we talked about at the top of the show with Matt Bradley, this is a volatile and extremely precarious moment. As we talked about, Leanne, the wrong word from a senator could mean a lot, right? The wrong move by an outside cyber hacking group like Anonymous could be really problematic, to say the least. You talked with Jen Easterly, exclusively a top cybersecurity official. Tell me more about what
she is. The top cybersecurity official. She runs U.S. cybersecurity. Used to be known, it still is known as CISA, but they've decided too many people don't know that acronym. So now they call it cybersecurity, which is more accurate. Bottom line, she says, you at home, regardless of what kind of company you're in, big, small, and all of us need to be prepared. Here's what she said.
Everybody's at risk. I mean, at the end of the day, we live in a world that is highly digitized, highly connected. The volume, variety, and velocity of data is growing exponentially. This can happen to anyone. There is no one that is immune from potentially getting hacked. And so the simple steps that you can take as an individual, the steps that you can take as a business are incredibly important in protecting. It's in some cases an existential issue.
Yeah. To be clear, she's not only talking about the possibility of another Russian attack against the U.S. As you know, there have been many food supplies, oil supplies, you name it.
You've covered them all.
She's talking about any and all cyber attacks. And yes, they are seeing an uptick right now.
So if you're watching this and you're like, great, what am I supposed to do? Tom, what are you supposed to do?
So let's go through the basics again of cybersecurity. And you should know this already. We've reported on it for years, and they haven't changed much. Never, ever click on that suspicious email or link. Tell your kids, tell your grandma, tell your employees. Use complicated passwords. I personally mix up languages. I use several languages in one password.
You fancy.
And numbers. What's that?
You're fancy, man.
Oh, yeah. Well, my wife is European, so I mix them all up and, mix. And then I use overseas zip codes, by the way. Okay, multi-step authentication. You should be doing that.
Yes.
Back up your computers to the cloud or to an external hard drive and keep your security software up to date. These are still the basics. This is still what they preach every single day. Follow these steps. You really will minimize your risk of being hacked.
So much focus on cyber right now. It's a great interview. It's a great scoop, and we're glad you brought it to us. Thank you, Tom.
You bet.
Appreciate it. During explosive new testimony today, you had a witness saying the accused leader of the January 6th riot, Guy Reffitt, had a gun and had zip ties when he tried to storm the building on the 6th. This is coming from a friend, right? A guy named Rocky Hardy, fellow member of that right-wing group, the Texas 3%ers, telling the jury he and Reffitt drove to D.C. from Texas in Reffitt's car, right? His Chevy that was loaded up with rifles, guns, ammo. He also testified that they joked about dragging House Speaker Nancy Pelosi down the steps of the U.S. Capitol. We should note Hardy testified as part of a deal with the government that they wouldn't use his testimony against Reffitt against him. Danny Savalos joins us now. So, Danny, this is a trial that we've been covering now since really it started, right? And just to remind people, this is the one where yesterday Reffitt's own son testified against him in this very dramatic moment. Today, you have what some observers see as pretty damning testimony from a friend, somebody who was with Guy Reffitt on the day of the insurrection. Give me your lawyer analysis here. How's this trial going for the defense and for the prosecution?
Not well. The public is getting a look at how the federal government works. You know that buddy of yours that says he'd be behind you no matter what?
Yeah, your ride or die friend, right.
Your ride or die friend, and even family members. When the federal government comes knocking, it's the rare individual that doesn't think eventually about themselves first and eventually decide to testify. So this defendant is learning very quickly and firsthand what happens when your alleged co-conspirator or even your own family member is approached by the government. Be careful, look at the bed you've made in terms of your family and your friends, and that's how quickly they will turn on you. And it's really very tragic watching his son or hearing about his son testify against this defendant and how he was so concerned that he even reported him to the FBI before they went on January 6th. So it's sad all around, but this defendant is learning, again, firsthand how efficient the government is.
But, this friend, Rocky Hardy, right, he's got this deal with the government, but could still face charges? How does that work when you have Hardy testifying to things that were done that are obviously, as we see in this trial, potentially criminally problematic?
If you have an agreement with the government, one version of that can be, hey, the stuff I talk about, that I testify about, you can't use that against me. But of course, if you're going to prosecute me, you might use all the other things, like, for example, the terabytes of video evidence of people going into the Capitol. He may be on there as well. So that's one agreement that he could have entered into with the government. It's a version of a kind of immunity. There are different kinds: use immunity, transactional immunity. It really depends on the fit and the needs of the government in a particular situation, and what defense counsel can come up with as a solution or a pathway through, and as soft as landing as possible for the client.
We've said, and the brilliant and inimitable Pete Williams has pointed out that while this is the first capital attack case to go to trial, it's not necessarily the most significant, but it is the number one, right? It is the first one. As you're watching this, Danny, and as you're looking at it through an attorney's eyes, what does this mean, in your view, for other cases that would still have yet to go to trial?
I really expect the only people who don't now have a realistic view of how these cases will go might be some defendants. And as a criminal defense attorney, look, sometimes you have clients that won't see the world for what it is. They just believe, against overwhelming evidence, that they are innocent. And maybe some of these remaining defendants will realize that rarely in the history of criminal prosecution have we had this much video and other evidence, digital evidence, other kinds of evidence, establishing where people were and what they were doing at a particular time. So some of these remaining defendants might actually watch this trial and make decisions about their own case as a result.
We've been showing, obviously, some of those pictures of Guy Reffitt. Danny, you make a good point on that. Danny Savalos, thank you. Good to see you. The Boston Marathon bomber will stay on death row after the Supreme Court today reinstated the death sentence for Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, reversing a federal appeals court decision that had voided it. He's 28 years old, convicted of joining his older brother in planting and detonating 2 pressure cooker bombs at separate spots near the marathon finish line back in 2013. You might remember some of these horrific images from then. 3 people were killed, hundreds of others were hurt, in some instances very seriously. And here's what Justice Clarence Thomas had to say about the ruling today, that Dzhokhar Tsarnaev committed heinous crimes. The Sixth Amendment nonetheless guaranteed him a fair trial before an impartial jury. He received one. I want to bring in Pete Williams to break down this ruling for us. What did the court hang its decision on here, Pete?
Well, they said the judge was right and that the Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was wrong about 2 things. Tsarnaev wasn't, remember, attacking the trial for his conviction. It was the sentencing hearing. And what his lawyer said is the judge made a mistake. He should have allowed more extensive questioning of the jurors, not only about whether they were exposed to news coverage, but in some depth about what that coverage was and what they saw and what opinions they formed. So it was the jury selection was the first part. And secondly, they said the judge improperly excluded some evidence about a completely separate crime. This was a triple murder in Waltham, Massachusetts, a couple of years before the marathon bombing. And Dzhokhar Tsarnaev's older brother, Tamerlan, was suspected of having been the person who brutally murdered these other 3 people in an apparent drug deal. Now, his lawyer said they should have been able to introduce that evidence because it would have shown that Tamerlan was violent and that he had his younger brother completely under his domination, which would have reduced the criminal culpability of the younger brother, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. But the court rejected those arguments on both counts and said the evidence about Waltham was very confusing. It would have just confused the jurors. It would have been sort of leading them down a rabbit hole that had nothing to do with the crime. So it was a 6-3 ruling. The 3 dissenters were Justices Stephen Breyer, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan. And they said, well, that other evidence was so important it should have been allowed in the trial. No member of the court thought the judge got the jury selection wrong.
That's interesting. I hear you talk about this, Pete, and I think about people in Boston. Can I be honest? I remember watching you on NBC News doing live coverage when this Boston Marathon bombing was happening and the manhunt. I mean, this was hugely dramatic, so impactful, I think, to a lot of people 10 years ago. They don't have to now go through another trial, right? I mean, I think this means something to people.
Well, there would have been if the Supreme Court had agreed with the First Circuit here, there would have been another sentencing hearing. Well, if the government decided to seek the death penalty again, and they probably would have.
I was going to say, do you think there's a chance they wouldn't have?
Well, I don't. I mean, Merrick Garland, the current Attorney General, has put a moratorium on federal executions, but not a moratorium on seeking the death penalty. And remember, the Trump administration started this the position of the government in the Supreme Court, because the case was originally filed when Trump was still president, saying, no, he shouldn't get a new sentencing. And the Biden administration continued that same argument. So both administrations agreed on this. So the government would have had to make a decision, though. All right, are we going to put people in Boston through this again? They're going to have to come and testify about how this ruined their lives. Now they won't have to do that. So there's a great deal of relief in Boston.
As we talk about the court, Pete, before I let you go, big stuff coming up, right? They could hand down some decisions at some point on big cases on guns, on abortion rights, an upcoming decision on Roe, of course, that everybody's thinking about that could overturn Roe.
Sure.
What's the expectation? I mean, I know that's sort of the billion-dollar question. You don't have a crystal ball, but we're going to get them sometime next week.
When?
Yeah, before June.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, the biggies, remember, so this case today, the Tsarnaev case and another one, they were both argued early in the term. Tsarnaev case was argued in October. The gun case was argued in November. The abortion case was argued December 1st. Big cases like that tend to come toward the end of the term. So, I mean, in theory, we're going to get decisions again on Monday. In theory, they could happen then, but I think it's more likely that it'll be probably in June that we'll get that one.
So the Biden administration now is offering something called temporary protected status to Ukrainians who'd been living here in the U.S. without legal status. So what does this mean, right? Put this into concrete terms. It means that the roughly 30,000 Ukrainians who've been here since before March 1st won't have to be deported. They can stay and work for another 18 months. And while some advocacy groups are applauding that move, some are also wondering why the U.S. has not moved as fast for people here from non-European countries when they've been basically begging for this exact same status for months. Vaughn Hilliard has the story.
Masses of people fleeing Ukraine.
Ukraine, it's like a hell. That's why we crossed to another country.
More than 1 million refugees have fled Ukraine to neighboring countries.
But what exactly is the U.S. prepared to actually do for those fleeing Russia's persecution in their home country?
Given the bipartisan support for Ukrainians, I think this is an opportunity to actually rebuild that pipeline.
On Thursday, the U.S. granted temporary protected status to the estimated 30,000 Ukrainians already in the country, but not here on visas.
We will be providing temporary protected status, TPS, to those Ukrainian nationals who are present in the United States as of March 1st of this year.
But the U.S. has not offered a special path for current Ukrainians to come to the U.S. as refugees. Instead, the U.S. has sent millions of dollars in aid, food, healthcare supplies, blankets, and deployed a disaster relief team to the region.
We're providing support to the Ukrainians in their fight for freedom. Military assistance, economic assistance, humanitarian assistance.
But this places the U.S.'s policy toward refugees and asylum seekers under scrutiny again. Over the last 6 months, the Biden administration has flown thousands of Haitians from the U.S.'s southern border to Haiti. In fiscal year 2021, the Biden administration welcomed just 11,411 refugees. When President Obama left office, the number into the U.S. each year, 110,000. By 2020, Trump had cut that number to just 15,000. President Trump even signing an order suspending admission of Syrian refugees into the U.S. during the country's long, deadly civil war.
How would you describe U.S. policy towards refugees in the last 20 years?
The United States had been a country that provided refugee resettlement to the most people in the world, and that really declined.
Vaughn Hilliard is joining us now. So, Vaughn, I'm glad you're here with us. You know, we heard in your report people who want the government to give similar status, right? Similar relief to non-European people from non-European countries here, Afghans, Haitians, for example.
Right.
What is your sense, based on the reporting that you've done on this issue, that the needle's going to move on that front, given what we just saw with Ukrainians?
Right. I think, Hallie, that the refugee advocates who have talked to hope that this propels the Biden administration, the agencies that largely view refugee programs within the government largely being crippled, especially over the course of the Trump years in which services dwindled. They hope that this helps propel those agencies and that effort to really not only take a hard look at what the U.S. can provide for Ukrainian refugees potentially, but also when we're talking about Haitian migrants, when we're talking about other individuals from Latin America here. And actually, just this afternoon, Hallie, there was breaking news in just the last couple of hours. The U.S. Court of Appeals actually ruled that there's this public health federal law, Title 42, which the Biden administration had used over the course of the last year to justify turning away a large number of those migrants who were arriving to the U.S. southern border around the pandemic, essentially claiming to minimize minimize the spread of a communicable disease here. But now with that ruling, which makes it more difficult for the Biden administration to turn individuals away at the U.S. southern border using the pandemic as a justification, the hope is that not only here with potentially these Ukrainian refugees that could come to the United States, but also those seeking asylum here at the U.S. border, that this process will increase now that this is a greater focus for the American public.
Vaughn Hilliard, live for us on this. Vaughn, thank you. I am sure you have noticed prices are up. And if you live in L.A., oof, look at this number. The price for premium, $7.25 a gallon. The regular is $6.65. That's bananas, right? According to AAA right now, gas in 9 states is on average higher than $4 a gallon. Since just Wednesday, the average is up 18 cents. Rewind to last week in the Ukraine invasion, up 29 cents since then. These are the biggest hikes of these kinds since Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. So why are they happening? What is behind this? We're here to explain. It seems like every day it gets a little more expensive to top off the tank.
It's usually like, oh, $30. Yeah, no, it was definitely like 45.
But why? It all has to do with the basic economic concept, supply and demand, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine front and center. Russia is the world's 3rd biggest oil producer, and prices are up because of concerns about how its war against Ukraine could disrupt its oil supply. After Russia invaded Ukraine back in February, the U.S. slapped sanctions against the Russian economy. And while they didn't put full sanctions in place against the energy industry, they did take some smaller measures. And because of question marks about Russia's ability to ship oil, some buyers have been scared away, meaning less supply and higher prices. There's another piece of this, too. Oil prices started rising before the invasion with COVID. At the beginning of the pandemic, when people were in lockdown and staying home, the demand for oil dropped a lot. With so much supply, prices dropped too, big time. At one point in April of 2020, dipping below zero. Keep in mind, the crude oil price makes up only a fraction of what you actually pay at the pump. Look at 2 months ago. A barrel of crude in the U.S. cost $83 on average. Break it down per gallon, that's $1.98. But you were paying more than that because you have to add in the cost of taxes, distribution, marketing, refining, which is why the price at the pump then was on average $3.41. Now it's $3.84, with real questions about how high it gets next. You got that question. I got that question. Everybody who drives has that question. President Biden kind of has that question, right? He says today it's a top priority to get prices, like including for gas, like we just talked about, under control. But he also had the opportunity to talk about some good economic news today. Surprisingly strong jobs numbers for February. We found out today that last month, 678,000 jobs got added, and unemployment fell from 4% to 3.8%. That's the lowest since the start of the pandemic. And the number on the left side of your screen, 678, that's way more than all the smart economists had predicted. They thought it was going to be something like 440,000 jobs added. Joel and Kent joins us now to break this down. It is great to see you, Joe. So first of all, why was this so much better than economists expected? And what are the areas that drove some of that, right?
We're basically seeing the fact that Omicron really had a muted effect on people going back to work. A lot of economists were worried about that. That's why that estimate was so much lower. But as a result of this number, it certainly was very strong across a bunch of different sectors. But one thing you have to remember is when you get into the details of this jobs report, the number one thing I like to look at is wage growth. And if you look at that, wages month to month only grew by 1 penny. Now, overall, over the last year, they've only grown 5.1%. You take a look at inflation, it's still at record highs, or 40-year highs, I should say. And inflation, 7.5%. So people are still struggling with gas prices, as you mentioned. Grocery, food, all of that stuff adds up, which means inflation is still outpacing wage growth, which justifies what Fed Chair Powell wants to do next month, which is raise those interest rates.
But explain then, businesses still dealing with the big labor shortage, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Businesses dealing with a serious labor shortage across all industries. We did see some good gains in hospitality and healthcare, construction, things like that. But there are shortages in education and across the board, even in retail and restaurants right now. And so that's where you continue to see the labor shortage happening. And when you go out and you're trying to resume what is the new normal, that's where you're seeing people not in those jobs and you're feeling that wait time or you're feeling that gap.
We talked about the unemployment rate ticking down a little. cool, great, except for groups who are left behind, right? So, for example, Black women, disproportionately affected, as we've seen economically during the pandemic. The only group, I think, to see a little bit of an uptick. It actually went up since last month.
Yeah, it actually went up by 1/3 of a point. And what's interesting here is that that is the only a race and gender group that actually saw an increase. Everyone else, including Black men, either held steady or declined. Now, if you're looking at the reasoning why, John Jay College is saying that, look, Black women work in a lot of social services and healthcare jobs. Those jobs have taken a long time to come back in this pandemic for the obvious reasons. The reason that you saw Black men do better in terms of the unemployment rate is because many Black men do work in warehousing, for example, or construction. And those areas have seen much more growth in the past 6 months to a year as the economy tries to make a comeback. So you are absolutely right. This economic recovery, this comeback, so to speak, is uneven. It is not equal, and it affects different people in very different ways.
Important to talk about. I'm so glad you did. Joe Lincat, it's so great to see you. Thank you for being on with us tonight on a Friday. Still to come on the show, students in Florida are staging these walkouts over a bill that limits how much classrooms can talk about sexual orientation and gender identity. We've got that just ahead in the local. And a bananas update in a story you probably heard about a few years ago. Officials say this California mom who disappeared for weeks actually faked her own abduction. More on the charges she's facing coming up. So the Smithsonian is kicking off Women's History Month by honoring more than 100 women in STEM who are trying to make the world a better place. And I cannot wait to show you how specifically they're doing it. It's very orange and it's very 3D. How's that for a tease? I'll take you to that exhibit in a couple of minutes. But first, NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day. And because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our D.C. bureau, at least 10 people went to the hospital after a huge gas explosion at an apartment complex in Silver Spring, Maryland. 3 of them were hurt seriously, according to officials. I mean, look at this video, right? 100 people now have no place to live. They do not have a home. Several people are still not accounted for. From our Southeast bureau, students in Florida staged walkouts to protest what critics call the Don't Say Gay bill there. That bill stops most classroom discussions about sexual orientation and gender identity in school. Local reports say one student even got suspended for organizing a walkout and handing out pride flags. And from our Northeast bureau, New York City public school kids can stop wearing masks inside as of today. Mayor Eric Adams made the announcement. Face masks will still be required for students younger than 5 since, as you know, they are not eligible for the vaccine yet. Businesses in the city are not going to have to check vaccine cards at the door starting next week, too. Any moment now, a Northern California mom who claimed she was kidnapped at gunpoint, beaten, branded by her captors 5 years ago, will hear the charges she's facing for allegedly making the whole thing up. You may remember her, Sherry Papini, and you may remember her because look at this. She was in headlines everywhere across the country back in November of 2016. Her disappearance set off this huge nationwide search. The FBI got involved. She had been missing for 3 weeks when she was suddenly found branded and chained to a highway on Thanksgiving Day back in 2016. At the time, her husband told ABC his wife had been tortured.
She literally lived through hell. The bruises were just intense. The bumps from, being hit and kicked and whatever else.
Her family now says in a statement just coming into us today that law enforcement is pitting Sherry and her husband Keith Papini against each other. So what really happened? Well, here's what police say, that she was staying with her ex-boyfriend just a few hours away from home all that time, and that all those bruises, all that stuff she had, self-inflicted, they say. Gotti Schwartz had been following the story from day one. There are a lot of layers to this story, right, Gotti? You think about the family here, and you think about the timing. We are 5 years plus removed from this. How did police finally figure out she was lying? Like, what happened?
Exactly. Here? Hallie, yeah, that criminal complaint that you just showed, it reads like a novel. Wow. And it seems to really come down to DNA evidence in the end. In particular, male DNA found on an article of her clothing that wasn't her husband's when she was adamant that it was 2 females that had kidnapped her at gunpoint, then held her for 22 days. Eventually, investigators were able to get what's called a familial match for that mysterious male DNA found on her clothing, meaning they got a hit for somebody who is related to the match. They did some digging. They found out that that partial match came back to a guy who had a son who was an ex-boyfriend of Papini.
Wow.
So they went down to Costa Mesa. They went into his trash. They took a DNA sample from a bottle of green tea, and voila, the criminal complaint says they got a match. They then confronted the ex-boyfriend. He told them everything. He said that Sherry Papini had asked him to buy burner phones to talk to her. They had been chatting for months. That he said she told him she wanted to run away from her husband and asked him to help her. So he headed up to Redding in a rental car, picked her up. He stayed with him allegedly for those next 22 days until he says she told him to take her home because she missed her kids on Thanksgiving Day.
But here's the thing, Gotti, and I just have to ask you, it's not like for those 22 days they were, sipping Mai Tais in a hammock. The criminal complaint says that she had him hit her with a hockey puck. She was branded, that she had him brand her to make it look more convincing, right? Does it at all explain why he helped her do that?
Yeah, so the criminal complaint details how he thought that he was helping her because she was making allegations of abuse. And like you just said, that criminal complaint includes a portion in which the ex-boyfriend says that she did most of the injuries on her body herself. But at one point, he asked her to, quote, bank a puck off of her, which he did. Then he told investigators she also asked him to go to Hobby Lobby to buy some wood burning kit, heat up some metal, and then brand her shoulder, which he also did. He also said when she was with him, she appeared to be set on losing weight. And eventually, when she was found, she was underweight. She had bruises on her body,
Wow.
and she had a brand on her right shoulder.
And those are all the things you just said are reasons why, for years now, people have viewed her as a victim, right? She got money, victim assistance money from California. She collected something like $50,000, according to prosecutors, from like a GoFundMe page. She's now facing charges that could be really serious,
Absolutely. $50,000 from a GoFundMe page, $30,000 from a victims fund in California. And pretty early on, given the nature of her story about kidnapping, the FBI was brought in. They stayed on that case. And so right now, one of the charges that she's facing is lying to federal investigators. The other one is mail fraud because some of those payments that she received from the state came through the mail. So she just made her first appearance in court today, and we're hoping to hear a little bit more a little bit later this afternoon.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know we're waiting on some of those updates. So, Gotti Schwartz, we'll keep an eye out for your reporting here on that. Thank you so much for being on top of this. Coming up after the break, the NFL officially benching all of its COVID protocols, why the league's deciding now to drop the rules, and what this could mean for other sports. And I got to help reveal this history-making exhibit at the Smithsonian honoring some amazing trailblazers this Women's History Month. Look at all that. We're going to show you more of it coming up in a sec. So the NFL has just become the first professional sports league to operate just like it did before COVID. With the league, its players' association suspending all COVID protocols. You talk about signs of things getting back to normal, quote unquote, the new normal. This is probably one of them. In a memo, the NFL explained it's because of, quote, encouraging trends regarding the prevalence and severity of COVID and the recent CDC guidance. So this means no more masking, no more social distancing, no more mandatory surveillance testing. Players and staff do not have to wear COVID tracking devices. But there's a caveat, right? Those protocols could come back at any time, according to the NFL. Dr. John Torres joins me now. And John, this is like symbolic, right? The NFL is in the offseason. I get it. There's still coaches and staff who work year round. But this feels like a symbolic moment in the sports world, which was, one of the first. And we saw it when the pandemic first started with the NBA, for example, being affected by COVID. Now you're seeing this stuff lift.
And Hallie, I think you're exactly right. And I think we're starting to see the turning point here. Not only people's opinion of where we're headed with the pandemic, getting to that endemic phase of the virus, but also you're starting to see real measures put in place based on what's going on around the country. And right now, 50,000 cases a day. We still do have 1,400 deaths, and so we still need to be careful. But the mandates are dropping across the country. Guidelines are changing, and so the NFL is kind of following suit with that. And what they're saying is exactly what you said, that they're going to drop a lot of their mandates for the players and for the staff. Right now, around 95% of the players are fully vaccinated, almost 100% of the staff fully vaccinated. And so it makes sense to do that in this case. But at the same time, they're saying, voluntarily, if you have symptoms, so they're using the honor system, then let us know. We'll test you if you're positive, obviously isolation. But they're also saying, hey, be ready, because we could all of a sudden go back to some of these different standards we have, depending on how COVID goes, because we might not be quite out of the woods yet, but I think we're getting very, very close, Hallie.
What's interesting is that you talk about teams or leagues that are still playing right now, NBA, NHL, they've relaxed their requirements, but they're not totally gone. Do you think this is a tipping point, Dr. John? Might we see other leagues do this?
I think you're going to see the other leagues do it, but I think you're going to see them do it a little more slowly. Main reason, if you look at the NBA and the NHL, they play indoors in smaller areas, smaller arenas, versus football, which plays either outdoors or in almost outdoor type stadiums, and so they don't have to worry about it as much. They have better ventilation. The NBA, you're going to have those children in there that can't be vaccinated. You're going to have the immunocompromised that the vaccines aren't working all that well. So I think they just want to be a little more careful, since fans are showing up right now, and they'll slowly start dropping those if we see the numbers continue to come down, which hopefully they will, Hallie.
Let me ask you about something else. I don't often, Dr. John, talk with you about Kyrie Irving, right? But let's talk about him. Obviously plays for the Nets, not vaccinated, can only play on the road. New York is ending. We just talked about how New York is ending its vaccine mandates, but it still applies to city workers, and that includes athletes who play there. Do you believe that is the prudent or best move? In other words, why would New York end the vaccine mandates for most people, but not city workers? How do they thread that needle?
And, I think part of it is because of who they come in contact with and what they do when they come in contact with them. And so they're trying to stop that spread. And same thing here with the NBA, saying, let's go ahead and make sure that they're either vaccinated or they're not playing to stop that spread. Again, when you look at the NBA, you see fans right around the perimeter there. The players get in close contact with the fans, and that could be an issue. Same thing with the city workers. They come in close contact with a lot of people. So I think they're just being a little more careful. And I think we learned from a year ago where we started saying, we don't need masks anymore. Things are getting back to normal, and then all of a sudden we had Delta and then Omicron. They're just waiting to see if the other shoe drops, and if it doesn't drop, then they're going to start releasing or relaxing even some of these, and I think that's when you'll see that, Hallie.
Dr. John Torres, thank you so much. Great to see you. So March is Women's History Month, and this whole month long, NBC is introducing you to trailblazers who are shattering glass ceilings and up-and-comers you don't want to miss. And let me blow your mind with a statistic here. Are you ready? Hold on to your brains. If you look at the top 10, the top 12 biggest cities in the country, let's say, biggest cities in the country, guess how many of their statues show actual real women? Half a dozen. That's it. Well, guess what? That statistic changes today. Look at this with the first look that I got this morning at a special exhibit that's opening this weekend right here in D.C. at the Smithsonian. This groundbreaking, really empowering thing that honors women power players in STEM. Consider the statues lining America's parks and city streets. What's missing? Women.
When our families and our kids are walking around, looking at the people that are held up as role models, they're not seeing anyone that looks like them. And we knew we wanted to fix that problem.
We're going to be 3D full body scanning you.
Now, the If Then initiative to support and honor women in STEM has created the biggest collection of statues depicting women ever assembled.
Nice.
This is gorgeous.
120 3D printed statues of real women, trailblazers in science, tech, math, and engineering, standing proudly at the Smithsonian in our nation's capital.
I am part of a team of scientists trying to save endangered species from extinction.
Women like Ray Wynn Grant, an ecologist and National Geographic explorer. It's all to inspire the next generation of STEM leaders.
If we show little girls all these amazing women doing amazing work in this world, then each of them are going to know that they too can grow up and change the world.
I wish I got to see this when I was a little kid.
Reminds me of how important representation is.
It's not just about my work, but about the work of everyone who looks like me.
So you saw Ray in that story right there. I had the unbelievable honor of helping her and her daughter and her mom, Tony, daughter Zuri, reveal the statue live on the Today Show this morning. It was so cool. We wanted to show you. Check it out. Do you want to show us your mom's statue? Do you mind doing the big reveal for us, yanking down that sheet, and let's do it?
Yes, I do.
All right, let's get it.
Ready?
All right, 3, 2, 1.
Look at that! It's me!
What do you think? Such a cool moment, and so many amazing women that have flown in from all over the country. Their parents, I got to meet so many of them. Very cool. Can't wait to bring my daughter, to go check that out. Have a great weekend. I'll see you back here Monday, same time, same place. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.